Welcome to True Crime with Emma Kenny. I release content every single Sunday, so if you are a true crime fan, please make sure that you subscribe, because then you won't miss any of the content that I release. And I don't want to have a go, but I do put quite a lot of effort into making these, so I would really appreciate it if you would just do that now. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about one of the worst cases of child molestation that I have ever heard about. And believe me, having worked in therapy and trauma for a very long time, I have worked with some sickening cases of child abuse, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and other really dark areas of the human consciousness. However, Richard Huckle is somebody whose name that I will take to my grave, because he is one of those human beings who was so depraved, but also so incognito. So I think we still like to believe that child molesters, and the reason I'm using the term child molester as opposed to paedophile is because there is a very clear distinction. I know that people don't necessarily get that, but a paedophile is somebody who has a predilection and attraction towards children for sexual purposes. It does not mean that they act on that. So there are a group of paedophiles called virtuous paedophiles who basically recognize they have an affliction, and also may also be attracted to same-sex or opposite-sex genders of a normal age, but recognize that they have an attraction to children of different ages, and they recognize that it is reprehensible, completely immoral, absolutely criminal, and they hate the fact that they feel that way. And there are groups of individuals who try to support each other, and they go to lots of therapy groups. And in places like Germany, when you have the X Factor, which is a music show in the UK, which is like a big music show, they actually have adverts that ask people who have feelings towards children to get in contact so that they can receive help. So a paedophile is not necessarily somebody who molests a child. A child molester is somebody who is a paedophile and who acts on those feelings. So in the UK, there is a belief that between 1 in 20 children and actually 1 in 6 children will experience some kind of sexual molestation. That is equally as terrifying, whether it's 1 in 20 children or 1 in 6 children. The point is that for some reason, there seems to be a huge attraction to children, which is utterly horrifying. And the story that I'm going to tell you today is one where an individual that didn't seem to show any signs and symptoms as a young person grew into probably one of the most dangerous and most prolific child molesters in the world. And I really do mean that. I mean in the world, because even though there have always been child killers and child molesters since the beginning of time, the internet has just changed everything. I mean, the belief is that 5% of the web is what we mostly see, so the light web, and then 90% of the web is the dark web, which is where you can kind of buy guns and sex traffic and do all the nasty things, get your drugs, etc. And then 5% is deep dark web, which I'm not even going to go into the things that I said go on there, because to be honest, it keeps me up at night. But essentially that has born and spawned this huge opportunity for deviants on every level to find kindred spirits. And psychologically, that's so dangerous. It's all very well feeling that there is something a little bit wrong with you, as long as you are conscious of that. And most of the time, if you recognize that there are lots of other people around you who just don't act that way, or you try to bring up a conversation about something and somebody finds it highly inappropriate, you usually get quite a lot of social cues that even if it stays with you, that particular predilection, you're less likely to act up on it because you've had enough of this reinforcement saying, mate, that's weird. If, however, you just type into the internet a particular desire and, thousands and thousands, millions in cases of people are saying that it's completely what they're into too, and there are accesses into these worlds, then you're not going to question it in the way that you would once have. And I think that's why we're seeing an increase massively in child abuse. And we are seeing a huge increase in child abuse. In fact, over the past 12 months, when we've had predators locked up with children, child abuse rates are going through the roof, including domestic homicide and domestic abuse. So the truth is that there are more and more victims of these unspeakable crimes. So Who was Rachel Huckle? Well, he was somebody who just didn't stand out. I'm going to put some pictures in. You can see he does look like that kind of odd one out, I would suggest. Maybe somebody who didn't fit in with his peers as he would have hoped to. He was relatively bright. He was a pupil at the Harvey Grammar School, and after school he went to South Kent College. He certainly wasn't somebody who, as a human being, as a child and young person, caused any obvious concerns to people around him. He was also known to go to Ashford Baptist Church, so had some kind of faith, shall we say. He attended a congregation in London. Could that be that he already knew from an early age that there was something wrong with him? Because boy, there was something very wrong with this guy. Was it that he was seeking redemption? Was it that he was hoping faith could protect him? Was it that he was just immersing himself around other young people? Because of course there are Sunday schools and there are access to children at churches. We certainly know that the church hasn't been innocent in areas such as child abuse, selling babies, murdering children. I mean, I think we can all accept that the church has definitely played its role in institutional abuse. But to all intents and purposes, he was described as a guy who was quiet and a bit of a loner. And I know it sounds kind of unfair to say this, but when you look at his pictures, you do kind of feel that he would be somebody who was a little bit of a loner, maybe on the outskirts of relationships. And the reason that I bring that in, it is important to note that when people don't feel that they fit in with their peer group, maybe they feel on the outside of the world that they want to inhabit, then they don't have the opportunities to mature in the way that one would hope to mature, because you kind of need your peer interactions, engagements, relationships to help you move through the transitions from being a very young child to being a teenager and so on and so forth. So certainly developmentally, if somebody isn't somebody who feels that they fit in with their community and their age cohort, then they may have some stunting in their developmental understanding and also their developmental acceptance. By the way, this definitely gives no reasoning or excuses to his behaviour, but if we're going to explore who someone is, then we definitely have to explore what formed them. But as far as he was concerned, he was brought up in a good family as well. Now, one of the things that was recalled by his pastor when his pastor of the church that he used to regularly attend was interviewed, because he went overseas and continued to go to churches, and you can do that. If anybody's travelled anywhere, I lived in Bali for a year, churches with expats were always around. So you could go to local churches or you could involve yourself in churches in the local area with residents. And the pastor there said that he would often come to church, but he rarely came unless there were children there. And I think we're given a direct insight to the fact that Huckle automatically found ways to surround himself with children. And I'm talking really the younger the child, the better, which is about as horrific for me as it can become. At 16, he went away for his first, what we would consider, travelling experience. He went away for a whole month. He went to a school in Namibia. And that was something that seemed to spark his interest. So, as I said, he wasn't an exceptional student, but he certainly was somebody who succeeded at school. After leaving education, Huckle became a TEFL teacher, which is Teacher of English as a Second Language. It's such a simple qualification to get. It might sound like it took a long time, but it really doesn't. It's really quick to achieve. And you have to remember, in countries like India and Africa and Indonesia, it's Southern Asia, all these different countries, you know, people with an English accent are often given a great deal more kudos than we should be. It's wrong that people hold individuals like that in high esteem, but obviously at times that's the case. And it means that people get access that they shouldn't have. For example, I lived in Bali for a year and they instantly believed that I was really wealthy and really clever, and that my life was amazing. It wasn't. I was a broke ass. But the point was that the colour of my skin and the fact that I was living in a different country when they couldn't afford a plane fare definitely in comparison, they felt that that was great wealth. And that meant that I was always invited places and people let me into their homes. And there was just this level of trust that was beautiful, that was given to me. But actually, you can just think about how that could be misused. And that's definitely what happens in this case. So when Huckle's 19, he goes away for a full year, a whole gap year. Loads of us did it. In Australia and New Zealand, they call it the OE experience, the overseas experience. But this is where things start to get really dark. Huckle starts using his volunteering to visit Christian orphanages in Asia. And he's not doing that because he cares about kids. He's doing that because he's recognized this very weak link. There are lots of vulnerable and poor children in Asia. And again, he's on a pedestal. He's this Western man. People assume all these positive things about him. So he instantly homes in on the most vulnerable, on the poorest of children. And his sex offences in those areas begin immediately. Absolutely immediately. And when I tell you a little bit about the kind of offences we're talking about, it chills me to the bone. It really does. He attacked boys, he attacked girls, he attacked toddlers, he attacked babies. Babies. Over 9 years, he got away with this. 9 years. One of the things that he would do was he would carry a camera with him, and he would often pretend that he was a travel photographer. But his way in was to encourage families to trust him with their children. Now remember, when people are poor and there are individuals who might give you money, you're not thinking that this is an individual who's twisted and sick and fantasizing about abusing their child. You know, as a parent, when you're struggling and you have an option to maybe be given some money and the consequence of that is some lovely photos are going to be taken of your children, often because it will also benefit you and your family to eat and all the things in between, you're going to agree to that kind of behaviour. Obviously, when you're in the Western system, that's just not something that the majority of us would do, but that's because we're constantly informed about how to protect our children, and rightly so. There are a lot of people out there that we need to protect our children from. This last year, believe me, I have realised that I need to protect my children from many more people than I knew. So because we are informed human beings, we tend to make decisions based on that principle. In countries where they don't even have TVs and where education is limited and where food is scarce, of course, somebody walking in with a camera and saying, "Can I borrow your children for an afternoon? Here's some money that's going to feed you for a week." It's going to be something that a lot of families do, and it's not because they want their children to be harmed. He would then take those children and take pictures of them that were massively explicit, really twisted, and of course then he would sell those videos to other paedophiles because the child molester networks are massive. And again, like I said, if you're somebody who views paedophilic material, child molestation material, you are a child molester. It doesn't matter if you've never laid a hand on a child. Without your eyes, there is no need for them. Therefore, you are molesting a child. In fact, if you're listening to this now and you look at child porn, you are still as responsible as the person hurting that child directly. Simple as that. Not that I'm suggesting any of you are, but you get my gist. So one of the occasions that we know about when he goes to court is that he actually pretended he was a teacher. So he'd go to very poor communities. How are these guys going to know? This young man turns up, he's got a certificate in TEFL, he's got money, he seems well-spoken, quiet. And that's one of the things about this guy. He's one of those human beings that doesn't really stand out. And I always say to people, I think that people would really love to be able to spot somebody who is dangerous, but that's why people get murdered, that's why children get raped, that's why women get killed. It's because you can't notice people by the way that they look. You know, people can seem completely ordinary and do extraordinarily horrible things to other human beings. So he appears, he worms his way into these communities and even into people's family homes. So this man is like a chameleon. He's constantly staking out new places to cause serious harm to children. And I remember, the police forces aren't going to be dealing with this, because communication, like over here in the Western world, in the UK, for example, systems work where there is intercommunication. That doesn't happen where you're in countries where there is great poverty and they're not developed fully. It's an impossible situation. And also, this is a really sad fact. Western human beings somehow get a free pass at times to behave disgustingly. Look at what happens in Thailand. I mean, people can pretend that Thailand is just this gorgeous destination where you can go and have exotic travel. And believe me, it is. I've been there. But it's also a foundation of horrific exploitation. And when I see, with respect, older guys getting on a plane by themselves, going somewhere like that, I'm not thinking he's having a nice 2-week break by the sea, just relaxing and reading some books. I'm not. I'm sorry that prejudice exists within me. You have a right to say what you think, but certainly for me, I'm thinking he's going over there for things that I think are unspeakable on the whole. That's the way I feel. I find the way that poverty and people who are poor are coerced into sexual situations because they have no other option is harrowing, disgusting. And even when we look at all the disasters in the world, things like the tsunami, you know who turned up there? Child molesters, because you know how it goes. If there are vulnerable children, you can bet your bottom dollar that a child molester is going to be on their way to try to find them. That's how depraved these human beings are. Now, like I said earlier on, this guy got away with horrific abuse for 10 years. This mild-mannered nobody managed to con his way into situations with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. The truth is, we'll never know the full number, but it was a decade of abuse. And when I talk about that in a little while, and for those of you who don't want to hear about child abuse, please do turn off now, because it's horrific. Because I'm going to go through how these kind of people and countries are exploited by Westerners for depraved use of their children, and actually of their young women and young men in particularly. So we know in 2006, when he goes on his gap year, he rapes 2 sisters, aged 4 and 6. So that's how early on, the first opportunity he gets in Cambodia, he rapes 2 sisters, really tiny girls. The injuries that occur to children of that age are lifelong, and that's before we even think about the hideous trauma. We know in 2011, he moves to Kuala Lumpur. He's also spent time in Vietnam and Cambodia. We know he's been to university, and this is when it starts to get really, really dark. As I said, he uses this lie that he's a freelance photographer, and he starts getting into orphanages and schools. You know why he's going to those places. He establishes lots of trust with the teachers. He has access to the orphanages and schools because he'd just be seen as this really nice guy. And he would go specifically for the children and young people who were the most vulnerable. He'd have been able to find out who they were. You know, it's not hard, is it? If you're in a school and you're trusted, you're going to be finding out from the teachers who those children are. And of course, he's going to be the hero, because that's the way that you ingratiate yourself to children. Remember, when you're grooming a child, what groomers do is they don't just go straight in there and harm them. They want to slowly warm the child up, because by confusing the child, by making the child think to themselves, this is a really good person, they're doing really nice things for me, it makes it far more difficult for a child to speak out. Because how can I speak out against somebody that cares for me, somebody who's given me things, given me nice days out, offered me presents, given me money? It's so conflicting. It's why it screws children up so much, because children are these beautiful, loyal creatures who just desperately want to be loved and liked. And child molesters know that, and they work that with such power and vigor of manipulation that children are literally no competition for them. You know, the child is just blindsided, firstly, by the fact that he offers them lots of days out, takes them to theme parks, which they would never be able to afford, takes photographs of them, takes them out for photography lessons, teaches them English. I mean, for some of these children, this would have been like winning the lottery. That's what's so horrific about child molestation. We have this idea that these are one-off events. They're not. These are systematic changes in the child's experience where they buy in loyalty because the thing that the person is doing with them feels good, and they believe that they're their friend. And so this whole manipulation is taking place whilst the child is just feeling in awe of this human being who's walked into their world and provided them with this opportunity to do things that they could have only dreamt of. And I mean it, it's really hard for people in the Western world to get your head around that. But for children who come from poverty, who have very, very low economic standards and opportunities, going to a theme park would be like winning a 3-week holiday in Florida, all expenses paid, holding the hand of Mickey Mouse all the way around, getting to the front of the queue on every single ride and getting to eat as much as ice cream as you could possibly wish to. We're talking that kind of comparison. What kind of kid wouldn't want that? So straight away, he's got this support system in place. The support workers love him. He's got this really generous, really educated Englishman working with them. And now he starts using his plan. He puts it in place. Because Huckle isn't just looking about exploiting those children for his own personal gain. He's looking at exploiting them for his own personal profit. He likes traveling. He likes raping children, and he likes an income for those opportunities. And you know what? There is a very lucrative income from the web. So he uses the entry into all of these situations to be able to start attacking children so that other people can engage in the sexual abuse vicariously. In fact, one of the things that Huckle did is he wrote a guide to sexual abuse. He called it Pedophiles and Poverty Child Lover Guide. Just let that sink in. Pedophiles and Poverty Child Lover Guide. I mean, the words, how fucked up is that, don't even come close, do they? Because one, he's saying paedophiles and poverty, i.e. making a perfect link. The poorer the place, the more likely you're going to get to be depraved around innocent, naive, beautiful children who should have their childhoods that are challenging enough just left to being childhood. But then it's the fact that he writes the word child lover guide. Because there is an idea within that, isn't there? That what he's writing about isn't molestation. It isn't about power. It isn't about systematic abuse. It's about child love. And it's about a child lover, as if a child can consent. And believe me, there is a whole movement of people out there right now who are still trying to suggest that paedophilia and child molestation is something that should be completely accepted and consensual. Believe me, they are out there. It's absolutely terrifying. They have organisations which they try to professionalise. I'm not even going to mention their name, because by mentioning their name, I might encourage people to go and look. And I don't want to give them any views at all. But there are groups of men and women, but mostly men, who have from the very early 60s and 70s tried to lobby governments to allow paedophilia to be seen as normal. In fact, they used to liken it to homosexuality. Now, the idea that they can't see the difference between two consenting adults and a child with a partner who's an adult blows my mind. But hey, they're missing something, aren't they? Without a doubt. We know from evidence of brain scans that there are some issues with child molesters' brains, but it almost feels like there's a missing link of morality there as well. Because as I said, you can have a lot of feelings, you don't have to act on them. And just to invite you a little bit into the horror about this man's mind, because that particular manual was 60 pages long, 60 pages. And in one area, he actually writes and boasts about the fact that he's hit the jackpot. He's managed to get a 3-year-old girl as loyal to him as his dog, and that no one cares. So he isn't just living and breathing his fantasy, he's sharing it all over the web. He's encouraging other people to do the same, and he's gloating about the fact that these fools around him, because that's what he thinks about the local community, these idiots are just letting him get away with it. He doesn't imagine for 1 minute that maybe these people who trust him because they believe the best in him, not the worst. And this 3-year-old child, of course, is being given gifts and looked after by him in many ways and is being used sexually. But if nobody's intervening around her, then the messages that she's getting from the adults won't be clear. They won't feel that something's wrong. That's one of the other confusing experiences about being a child of abuse. You're kind of looking around you and thinking, this just happened to everybody. And whilst at 3 years old, that's very young, believe me, she will have memories. I work with people who have memories from 3 years old of horrible abuse, and it's a lifelong affliction to have to manage that trauma. You can get through it, you can survive it, you can thrive in the end from working through those experiences. But imagine what it would have been like for that little girl, and then he compares her to a dog. You know, he even bragged when he was online talking to other perverts that when you go to poor countries, it's miles easier because you can seduce them. That's how screwed up his belief system is. You can seduce them more easily than middle-class Western children. Seduce. Look at how they use that language. When you hear sexual abusers, particularly towards children, using language, they'll often use language that would be acceptable if they were talking about someone of the same age or in the same area of age as them. So 17-year-olds with a 17-year-old, 25-year-old with 25-year-old, anybody who's consenting over the age. And I'm not talking about 55-year-old men with 16-year-olds. Sorry, I struggle with that stuff, but just a personal thing. I know it's legal, but it's just one of those things that concerns me a little bit, because I think at 16, you're really not functioning like you are when you're 30. But again, that's just my point of view. Do please feel free to disagree with me. That's why YouTube exists. But all I'm saying is it worries me. But the idea that he can use words like seduce suggests that a child can be engaged in a consenting relationship, can feel that they wish to engage. They are being seduced into it. It's not I'm sadistically harming this child. It's I'm engaging this child in an equal relationship where they feel sexually connected to me. He manages to carry on this range and rate of systemic abuse for years, as I've said. But one of the things about a lot of individuals who may not have stood out in their worlds as youngsters, and I do think going back to that idea about developmentally he wasn't very mature, he hadn't been very popular, obviously he's deeply broken and flawed psychologically, and he's incredibly dangerous. But the thing about being on the internet is it gives him a space to thrive, a place where he's accepted, a place where he's validated, hugely validated. These other child molesters love the content. He is their wet dream because of the fact that he will do what they ask, and he enjoys the gratification from that. And of course, on an ego level, that starts to drive him more and more to try to create content that is in line with what other people wish to see. Now, one of the things that actually got this guy caught was officers from the Australian force, which is called Argos. We have the same in the UK. We have a whole huge system of police task force dealing with trying to take down online abuse. The Australian Force Argos were actually tasked to stop the paedophilia tourism, as it's known. And as they started to do that, they were able to look into the fact that there was this intrinsic world of Western paedophiles who could actually help each other online. So they find a way of getting involved in the dark web. And there's this network within it called the Love Zone. Oh, immediately, anything on the dark web that has a title like that, you know it's going to give you nightmares. Now, Huckle, he's got a massive ego now. He thinks he's completely untraceable. He thinks he's anonymous. He thinks no one's coming for him. He feels completely above the law. He feels like he's got the perfect operation going. And he boasted so much about how susceptible his victims were. And he would show these hideous humans this material. And for that material, they would pay him. So he had this real business going, you know. He had access to all these kids. He had connection with the community. He had his knowledge of computers, and he had created this network, and he was getting paid for it. Some of the abuse that he involved himself in is actually too much for me to talk about online because I find it triggering and I don't want to trigger anyone else. But I'm telling you, it was from babies onwards, okay? So that's how terrifying it is. In fact, when I think about the crimes that this man committed, I think about Ian Watkins from the Lost Prophets band. He's serving 29 years in prison, and some of the crimes that he carried out just are really, really similar. They are the most grotesque, the highest level scale of abuse that can be imagined. But I'm not actually going to go through the kind of crimes that he committed and the acts that he committed, because I think anybody, believe me, whether you've been sexually abused or otherwise, you just won't be able to sleep if I tell you about it. Obviously, you can read about the case if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but for me, it's the most heinous type of child abuse that I've ever read about and been witness to. It really, really is. Now, Argos are investigating this paedophile tourism, and they come across this individual called Shannon McCool, and they're being very clever with their investigation. They really are. If you could see some of the ways that the police have solved crimes, you're talking about a particular case that I was aware of where a child had been seen being sexually abused in a picture. And the officers managed to look at this picture, and they looked around the room in this picture, and they found a printer, a small picture of a printer in this room. And they managed to look at the code on the printer. And then they got in contact with the company who created it. They found that only a few had been made because of a fault, and they then traced that child through that printer. That's how incredible some of the investigations can be. They are that diligent, but they're dealing with millions and millions and millions and millions of pictures every single day. It is so huge, child pornography and child abuse, that they really are fighting against a sea that is torrentially aggressive. Now, what the officers managed to do is they're able to assume the actual identity of McCool online. So they've arrested this individual. They've got that individual in prison, but now they are McCool online. They've got the identity, and so they carry on engaging with other paedophiles, one of whom was Richard Huckle. Now, let's not forget how horrific that would be for the officers involved. They often can't work for more than 6 months in these areas. They're often vicariously traumatized because seeing horrific pictures of children being horribly molested is not something that anybody is going to find a simple task. It's going to be absolutely traumatizing, and that's how you should feel, because if you don't feel like that, there is something not quite right in your processing. But these police had to take on that persona to make sure that they protected hundreds and hundreds and thousands, they actually think, of other children. So they now have contact. One of the things that Richard Huckle really screws up over is, of course, he's in his trusted circle. He's talking to people that he knows. He's got that massive ego. So he tells all these other child abusers that he's not going to be around for Christmas, because he tells them that he's going home. So now the police know that Richard Huckle is going to be turning up at Gatwick Airport on December the 19th, 2014. So they get him at the airport. At that point, they arrest him. It means he can't leave the country. But even though they have all of this evidence from the Australian police, because he hasn't got any previous convictions, he's never been in trouble, never so much as a driving offence, he's actually bailed home. So we have this incredibly dangerous human being who has been granted bail under the conditions that he lives at his parents' address and whilst the investigations are in progress. Because there's not been any previous criminal record, you can imagine, can't you, that his family would just be completely stunned. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they've got this lovely son going and taking pictures of impoverished children, working voluntarily in schools, being seen as a support network around these poor countries, to suddenly be looking at the possibility that no, their child was actually an opportunist child molester, literally stalking out poverty so that he can use it to share with his online social network of depravity. Imagine, how would you make that leap? I mean, I think I know my children, but don't we all? How would you feel as parents if you find that your child's been bailed to your address and they are saying that he is responsible for probably some of the most disgusting and depraved crimes that even you as a parent have ever heard of? So they let him go home. They tell his parents, obviously, that he has to remain there under their care. And at that point, they seize all his equipment because it's going to take time to analyse it all. And that's one of the things that we know the police do. They take laptops, they take telephones. If you've got any other equipment in the countries that you might have been living, they'll get all of that because they need to compile the evidence. And they also need to grade the evidence. So sexual abuse is graded with children in different levels because there are different kinds of abuse, so to speak, and they go in grades. So they're going to have to spend time doing that. He didn't make any comment throughout his police interview. I am imagining at that point it's because he's thinking that they're going to struggle to find witnesses. Maybe he feels that they won't be able to find the information. Maybe he's just buying time. You know, maybe he's just thinking, I'm completely banged to rights here, but I'm just going to say nothing. Maybe he felt shame because he realised that he was going to have to confront all of those feelings and all of that knowledge that his family were going to be absolutely ashamed of him. I mean, they're big feelings to deal with. Even if you are somebody who deserves every second of it, it doesn't mean that you're not going to feel that prick of conscience about the impact that you're going to have on the people that have brought you up. Now, he is confronted by his mother when he's at home. And under the influence, he's very drunk at the time, he does admit to raping children. He admits that. And it is as simple as this. His parents are like, get out of my house. And I have such respect for them. I really do. The power and strength it takes to tell your child to get out of your home, to instantly believe that he is so reprehensible you want nothing to do with him. You know, to have no sympathy, no empathy, no willingness to kind of go, okay, what went wrong with you? What happened to you? Just to be like, get out of our house. We don't want anything to do with you. That just demonstrates the normal reaction of aversion that the adults that we know and love around us usually feel when somebody has abused a child. That's what you feel. Absolute aversion. Like you either want to harm the person who's done it or you want to get them away from anywhere near you. So he's thrown out. He returns to police custody because when you've been bailed to an address and you can't get another address, and let's be honest, none of your friends are going to be putting you up, are they? They're not going to be like, come on, Huckle, come around to my house because you seem like a really safe kind of human being and you're not strange at all. Now, at this point, he's actually confessed to his mother. His mother's told the police, so said that he's admitted it. And he has to go back into custody because obviously he's got nowhere to stay. And at an initial hearing at the Old Bailey on January the 6th, 2016, he pleads not guilty to 91 charges. 91 charges. And they were the only ones that they found at the time involving child abuse. Now, it has to be noted here, the investigators were actually only able to access a tiny, and I mean a tiny tiny percent of the abuse within the laptop that they managed to take, because he had this incredible ability to encode most of the evidence. Think about that. He was charged with 91 separate cases of child molestation, serious, highest grade. And yet he was so clever that he had managed to keep most of it submerged. And for people like you and me who maybe don't know a great deal about the internet and how dangerous it is, this is how a great deal of it works. You just can't get in there. There is just so much encryption and so much protection that it's almost impossible, even for people like the police who should have access to these kind of things, to actually break into. He completely refused to help the officers to cooperate in retrieving the data. As far as he was concerned, he didn't want them to see any more. Again, what does that say to you? That doesn't say to you somebody who's got any conscience, does it? It doesn't say to you someone who's willing to acknowledge their crimes, because if you're like, oh my God, I've been found out, obviously I'm a terrible human being, I desperately need help, I'm just going to be really honest and own up to all this abuse, so that they're also able to hopefully tell the parents of the children's lives that I may have ruined what's happened to them, to give them the dignity of that knowledge. No, he just doesn't help at all. He does, at a preliminary trial hearing, admit to 71 of the 91 charges that he's facing. And the reason for that is because there was a request, obviously, by the prosecution to watch the evidence against him in court. Now, that might sound absolutely disturbing, that the prosecution would say, okay, we need to see this abuse. But if you're going to convince a jury that somebody needs to be locked away, in my opinion, for 1 million years, literally, if there was an opportunity to lock somebody away for 1 million years, I know it's not actually going to work because they will just die of old age. But, you know, if you can only give a sentence, 1 million years doesn't come close to how long they need to serve. That means that he's going to get banged to rights. He's going to be found guilty straight away. And so he admits 71 of the cases, which means that they obviously won't have to show all of those horrific images to what would have been an incredibly traumatised judge and jury. He's charged with rape of a child under the age of 12. He was charged with digital penetration. He was charged with child abuse, facilitating the commission of child sexual offences by creating a paedophile manual. He was denied bail, obviously, at that pre-sentencing, and he was imprisoned at HMP Lewes before he was transferred to HMP Belmarsh in London to await the actual trial. During the hearings in court, the full scale of his crimes became apparent, and the prosecution were able to show that he literally started to abuse children in 2006. He continued all the way through until he was apprehended in 2014. Obviously, we know that the crimes were absolutely horrific. They involved the rape of children under 12, possession and distribution of child pornography, creation of child pornography, child abuse, creating a paedophile manual entitled Pedophiles and Poverty, Child Lover Guide, as I mentioned, digital penetration of a child under the age of 12, and raising money for his activities via a crowdfunding website. A crowdfunding website. And let me tell you as well, if you want to do some research, you want to research some of the biggest crowdfunding that's ever occurred through, shall we say, television programs. And you want to have a look at where some of the money's gone for that. It doesn't have to just be underground, where money is raised and used inappropriately. Believe me, bad people often end up in very powerful positions. I think we all relate to that right now. His victims ranged from 6 months to around 12 years of age. And I doubt very much that any of those children who were abused will have had any kind of help coming to terms with what happened to them. Maybe their parents never even found out. We do know that Huckle belonged to that website called the Love Zone on the dark web. We know that that was very, very difficult to get into. It had anonymised means. People weren't represented as the people that they were. But he shared photos of his crimes with 27 other members. He boasted constantly. He talked about, as I said earlier on, hitting the jackpot with a 3-year-old girl. He knew that it was so easy to coerce people who were in poverty to allow him access to children. One of the things that he actually wrote about was that he wanted to marry a girl that he'd raped from the age of 7. he wanted to have children with her. And then he said he wasn't a great big fan of incest. So think about that thought process. He says that he wants to marry a girl that he raped from the age of 7 and have children with her. But then he's like, but I don't know whether I might sexually abuse my own children. Maybe not. This is how absolutely depraved this man is. And he's not on his own. That's the thing that we've got to remember. This is not a man acting in isolation. This is a man who's got a crowdfunding site so that he can continue with this kind of abuse. These kind of individuals are supported. It's terrifying. They managed to trace back 29 victims, but they think there were thousands. He had over 20,000 photos. And remember, this is a tiny amount that they uncovered, and videos as well. But they believe that there'd be at least 200 victims all over Southeast Asia. Also, thousands more photos encrypted areas of Huckle's laptop. And the vast majority of the children that were abused will have gone unknown because they just couldn't get the information out of there. It just is terrifying. It came out in court that the tactics that he used to make sure that he ensured the trust of the children was, I talked about a little bit earlier, taking children out on day trips from orphanages, escorting them home for their own birthday parties. He even talked about marrying his young victims so he could set up a foster home and abuse a cycle of children who'd passed through his home, and then basically turn paedophilia and child molestation into a full-time job. Literally, that was quoted in court. He also used to keep a score of the abuse, and he would score the scale of abuse that a victim suffered. That's how they found out that they thought he'd abused at least 200 children, because he literally kept a score of the type of abuse that those children suffered and the enjoyment that he got from it. One of the things that I find indefensible of this man is that he refused to cooperate with the police in letting them have access to his laptop, because I think that he probably knew that that would also identify other people. And the idea that he would have loyalty to complete perverts as opposed to a recognition of the crimes that he'd carried out makes me feel that this is an individual who could never have been helped. Like, I don't believe that he should ever walk the earth freely, but I also don't think that anybody should waste any money on him with therapy, because I don't think that kind of person like this can ever change, because you would at the point of recognizing that you're going to go to prison when you're dealing with all these people clearly saying to you, this is so bad that you're going to go away for a very long time, that you might have this spark of conscience where you say, maybe it's because I've done something that's hugely damaging. The fact that he wouldn't cooperate in that way says to me that he didn't actually think he was guilty of doing anything. And probably because of the countries he was in and the fact that he got away with it so easily, maybe even paid some parents off. We know that that happens in certain countries. He probably didn't feel that he was really guilty of the crimes that he would have felt guilty of had it happened in UK territory. So the trial only lasted a very short time. It was 2 days. He was found guilty on every single count. And on June the 6th, he basically faced justice for all the misery and sadness and trauma that he'd inflicted on so many hundreds of children. When he was sentenced, he actually put his hands together like he was praying. I'm not sure he was praying to the same God that I would be praying to. Not sure whether the hands should be maybe down as opposed to up, but nonetheless, he gets sentenced to 22 life sentences, 22 life sentences, with a minimum of 25 years to be served before eligibility for parole. Now, I would have those 22 life sentences being concurrent, but nonetheless, the point is that he gets 22 life sentences, 25 years that he's going to serve, and the chances are it would be very hard for him to ever get out, because he would be seen as a very, very dangerous man. Now, this is the bit that really gets on my nerves. So he hasn't helped the police. He tried to say he was not guilty, and then he wants to give a statement, because you can do that. You can give a statement to the press. So through his lawyers, he sends out this statement, and this is what it says. I really understand and acknowledge the true scale of damage it caused to the Malaysian community. I had hoped to escape this mundane life of solitude in the UK, yet was overwhelmed by the attention I received in Malaysia. I completely misjudged the affections I received from these children. My low self-esteem and lack of confidence with women was no excuse for me to use these children as an outlet. I am open and eager to rehabilitate from this offending behaviour. I don't want to become a martyr to the sex tourism in Malaysia. This was all my doing as a consequence of my immaturity, and I am truly remorseful. I don't want to become a martyr of sex tourism in Malaysia. This was all my doing as a consequence of my immaturity, and I'm truly remorseful. You get to be remorseful for smashing a window with a ball when you had a mood as a kid. Immaturity doesn't make you a prolific paedophile child molester. That's because you are a deviant man with a predilection for harming children and babies. Can you hear the way that these kind of humans act psychologically? They're the victim. Oh, if only I'd been more included. Oh, if only I'd been more popular. Oh, if only girls had liked me. I wouldn't have had to create a systematic program of abuse involving thousands of children to share with people online so I could crowdfund my sexual abuse of children all over the continents, because at the end of the day, I'm simply just somebody who couldn't score a girlfriend. That's the kind of victim blaming that we expect. So what he was doing was he was projecting his own apparent remorse onto others for not making him feel needed enough. And that's what's so dangerous about manipulators and child molesters. They genuinely believe that it's not their problem. And they often believe that the relationships of harm are actually consensual. So that statement in itself demonstrates that he was one of those human beings that would only ever see himself as the one who was harmed. He felt sorry for himself going to prison. In spite of that pathetic statement that Huckle put out, the judge actually stated that he carried out that campaign of rape and it was driven by his own sexual gratification. He said, "You have pleaded guilty to as many as 71 sexual offences. It is very rare indeed that a judge has to sentence sexual offending by one person on such a scale as this. In my view, you may well harbour feelings of regret, but there is no feeling of genuine remorse in this case." And that's really important because he saw straight through this man's belief that somehow he was the victim. Now, where does Richard Huckle's story end? Well, surprisingly, a lot quicker than you'd imagine. Now, even though Huckle was given 25 years, he didn't get to serve them because in 2019, he met a pretty horrific death. In fact, he was murdered by a fellow inmate. And actually that inmate was an individual who themselves had been involved in a severe sexual assault. Huckle had his hands and feet bound and gagged. He was strangled using an electrical cable. He was raped. He had his jaw broken. He had some utensils inserted up his anus. And then he had a pen with a blade attached to it inserted into his brain via his nose. The attack was literally described as tortuous. It went on for a very, very long time. And the whole premise of it, according to what was said in court, was that it was designed to humiliate and degrade Huckle. Paul Fitzgerald, who was actually found by the prison staff straddling Huckle's body, surrounded by all the blood, actually also said he wanted to cook and eat part of Huckle's body after the attack. It's unusual that somebody as broken, dark, depraved, disgusting, deserving of such a sentence actually manages to meet somebody potentially even more dangerous. But it does seem that the universe collided, and that's exactly what happened. So Fitzgerald was then handed a life sentence for Huckle's murder. and he was given 34 years before being allowed parole because of the very sadistic and premeditated nature of the attack. I don't know how I feel about the ending of this. I don't know how I feel about knowing that Huckle is no longer walking this earth. I do know that the way that he was murdered is something that, even in spite of the atrocities that he carried out, he definitely didn't deserve. I wonder what provoked Fitzgerald to do that. And it's not because I don't see that he was a violent sex offender. He raped that particular individual. I'm saying, what was it about the child abuse that maybe he found out about that triggered him to want to harm Huckle and torture him so dramatically? There is a belief that around 70% of men who are in prison have been sexually molested themselves as children, and I wonder about internalized rage. I also know that when you go to prison as a child molester, you are considered the lowest of the low. All of that said, nobody deserves to die that way. From torturer to being tortured. What a journey. I don't know whether it will have brought peace to any of his victims. And as I said, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. But that really is how the story ends. I feel like today has been a heavy case. Richard Huckle is somebody who makes me feel really chilled when I think about his name, when I see his pictures, when I imagine all the crimes that we're not aware of that he carried out. And it also equally upsets me to think about the fact that in a prison in the UK, the kind of attack and relentless torture that took place where he met his end was allowed to happen. There are some severe issues on all those levels. Thanks for joining me. As ever, if you want to listen to more true crime, please do. I will be back on Sunday next week with another story. Subscribe to my channel, please. I love hearing your comments. I love watching your interactions, but I really like subscribers too. That makes a big difference to me. Also, remember, I've got a free app called Happy Wellbeing out. It's on the App Store and it's on the Play Store. It's completely free, always will be, and it's all about well-being and happiness and health and things like that. And stay tuned for the next True Crime with Emma Kenny.